Welcome to the NRI webinar series. Today we're really fortunate to have a wonderful panel to talk about the integrity of carbon offsets. NRI was formed in 1976 as the research arm of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and its members. We have provided detailed research, assistance to regulatory commissions, and training to regulatory commissions since 1976. This webinar is part of our training or promotion of information on the cutting edge of issues affecting regulation in the United States and around the world. I'd like to welcome you all. For those of you who are in the East, good afternoon. For those of you who are in the West, good morning. And for those of you who are in Europe, good evening. So I think we have things pretty well covered. I'd like to first motivate the reason why I was so interested in having this panel and this discussion on carbon offsets. NRI, as a team, wrote a paper for the National Engineering Energy Technology Laboratory, NETL, on the economics of carbon capture. And in the process of writing that paper, one of the issues that we looked at as a consequence of our position as a regulatory research organization was how regulators would look at investments, the prudence, if you will, of carbon capture. And one of the questions that quickly arose was, as any good regulator would ask, what are the alternatives? And one of the alternatives was offsets, or is offsets, so that one way for a utility to decarbonize is to purchase offsets, as opposed to potentially building carbon capture. The more we looked into offsets, the more questions arose as to how regulators would look at offsets in what we call compliance markets, where the utility, if you will, was required to decarbonize. And the more we looked at it, the more we started wondering about the integrity of carbon offsets and the need to have some sense or some way for regulatory commissions, public utility commissions, to have some level of certainty that the offsets that their utilities were investing in were really something that was providing value to the customers. And so we did what we normally do at NRI, is we try to bring together a group of experts who really know the subject well and who are able to opine on these issues. And today we just have a fantastic group of experts. I'm going to introduce you to them. The format is going to be each speaker will give a brief talk for 10 minutes or so. Then we will break for questions. Please use the Q&A bar at the bottom of the Zoom page. There we go. And also, we're encouraging conversation amongst the speakers. Each speaker, as you'll see, has a little bit of a different perspective, but all very interested in the importance of offsets. So let me introduce the various speakers. The first speaker is Dirk Forrester, who is currently the CEO of the International Emissions Trading Association. Dirk has a long history with carbon offsets and issues of decarbonization. He was the assistant secretary at the Department of Energy for Congressional, Public, and Intergovernmental Affairs, after which he went to the White House under President Clinton, where he was chairman of the Climate Change Task Force. He was an early innovator at the firm NatSource on the development of carbon offsets, and ultimately became the president of the International Emissions Trading Association. And for each of you who belongs to an organization, please, while you give your comments, give us a little bit more information about your organization so that people know, have other sources on where to provide, to get information or further information. Commissioner Dave Danner, or I should say Chairman Dave Danner, is the chairman of the Washington Utilities and Transportation Corporation. He has a long career in energy and telecom issues in the state of Washington, having served as an expert and as an advisor to the legislature, to the governors, to the commissioners at the Washington Utilities and Transportation Corporation, and ultimately being assigned or nominated by Governor Inslee to be a commissioner and then ultimately to become chairman. Jason Gray is substituting for William Boyd today. Professor Boyd got called away at the last minute, and we were fortunate that he arranged for Jason to substitute for him. Jason currently works with William Boyd at the University of California in Los Angeles. But prior to that, he was the chief of the Cap and Trade program at the California Air Resources Board. So Jason really was the person who led the development of the offset program and various mechanisms associated with cap and trade in the state of California. And so we're very pleased to have him. And last but certainly not least, we have Annette Nazareth with us. She's chair of the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. And she's currently a senior counsel at Davis Polk and is a former commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We can fill up our hour and a half by talking about all of their accomplishments, but we're not looking at the past, we're looking at the future. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dirk Forrester, who's going to give us an overview of issues with respect to carbon offset markets. Then Dave Danner is going to talk about current issues with respect to offset markets in a regulatory context in the state of Washington. Jason Gray is then going to talk about the way in which the offset markets were implemented, again, in a regulatory context in California. And then Annette is going to talk about efforts to increase the integrity of carbon markets worldwide, but voluntary carbon markets. And during this hour and a half, we will be differentiating between what we mean by voluntary and compliance markets. Dirk?
Thanks, Carl. And it's really terrific to be with everyone today and talking to a group of very influential people here, I think, in the state regulatory community, because you are already coming across these issues. You've dealt with them in the past, but I think they're rising in importance, especially in the United States, where the lack of a federal program is putting a lot more pressure on states to develop programs with your companies to be resilient out into the future, resilient against climate change, but also resilient in terms of the economic underpinnings of your economies. There's a massive transition coming at us, most of it framed by the efforts of nations to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement has a component dealing with emissions trading, although if you read it, you wouldn't recognize it. It's Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that talks about voluntary cooperation between nation states. But within that article, there is scope for countries to devolve responsibilities to corporates. And there's also the possibility of voluntary markets picking up the slack in many jurisdictions where regulatory programs aren't in place. by far the largest markets in the world in the climate arena are compliance markets, led by the European Union's emissions trading program that many of you would already be familiar with. It's a regulatory program for all the large stationary sources. For a while, they were allowed to use offsets created under the Kyoto Protocol, but now we're in a kind of a new era where there's interest in developing removal technologies that might create a type of offset that would be recognized in Europe. But right now, the dominant type of unit used for compliance in Europe is a government-issued allowance to permit, which you would all have familiarity with from the way SO2 programs work in the United States. So they followed that model in Europe. China has also picked up a lot of lessons from Europe and is operating a compliance market across its power sector, and it has hopes of extending that to other heavy industries. South Korea has a program in place that's been operating for several years that is also designed with many elements common to the European system. And here in the US, our main systems are in California, and I'm really glad Jason's here. We're old friends from the battles on AB 32 in California, but also in standing up a very successful market for the state of California, but one that grew out of a regional initiative in the West, the Western Climate Initiative, back in the, I guess, the mid-2000s. And then the RGGI program in the Northeast states is also quite important for the power sector again, power sector coverage, but showing a price of carbon, but again, primarily an allowance program. California's system does have scope for offsets, and interestingly has recognized some of the standards that are used in voluntary markets. So I want to give you a little sense of where that came from. Earlier in my career, Carl, before I was at the Energy Department, I was on Capitol Hill as a cub lawyer working for a congressman who was interested in applying the same trading principles that we'd used to solve acid rain, at least to solve it politically, but to apply that to climate change. So he was part of a little group of congressmen back in and congresswomen back in that time period of the early 90s that were exploring how you could set up a carbon offset program for the United States. It got surpassed by many other things, but what it did do was establish a voluntary reporting system at the Department of Energy that some of the companies that are regulated by folks on this call would have had experience with. We didn't necessarily know at that point in time what the future might hold. So a lot of it was about credit for early action and companies making voluntary pledges, but also reporting data annually to the Energy Information Administration on their emissions, but also on the activities they had underway in particular project categories. Growing out of that experience, the US got behind an effort in the Kyoto Protocol to include a carbon offsetting provision known as the Clean Development Mechanism. And the US then pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. So a lot of US companies were didn't have access to the Kyoto markets unless they had activities abroad. A lot of US companies did get experience with that. But in the US, much of the attention turned to voluntary efforts and what could companies pledge to do and what offsetting standards might they contemplate. Some of them continued to report into the 1605B database, but over time they gradually started utilizing private standards like the American Carbon Registry or the Verified Carbon Standard that's run by Verra or the Climate Action Reserve in California. There's also one in Switzerland known as the gold standard. These are all independent standards, but they operate a set of methodologies for quantifying and verifying that an emission reduction has occurred. And they issue credits, again, for voluntary markets into registries that they run for that purpose. Those same institutions have been recognized, as I mentioned, in the California program, but in other places as well. There's a carbon tax in Colombia that recognizes the VCS and the gold standard. There's a carbon tax in South Africa that also recognizes those standards. But most importantly, I think for the US, is that the international aviation community came together around a carbon offsetting program for the aviation sector, for international aviation. aviation. They call it the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Core Scheme for International Aviation, CORSIA. And that program has recognized, again, for compliance, some of the voluntary standards for certain scopes of the activities that they undertake. That's really influenced the scaling that we've seen so far in the voluntary markets. In the last 3 years, there's been quite an acceleration of growth, even during the pandemic, for voluntary offsetting. But as we look out across the future, the coming decade, there's much more potential. And much of that is being driven by a topic that Annette knows quite well around carbon disclosures at the SEC. This is something that the Biden administration is looking at right now, and the current SEC has issued a rulemaking on it for what should constitute a corporate claim for net zero. If you've got a pledge to get to net zero by 2050, you're not going to necessarily be able to do all of that on site. So some of it will likely be through carbon credits of some type. There's heightened interest in making sure that all of these standards are meeting certain threshold standards. And I'm going to let Annette talk about the Integrity Council, which is one that AIDA has been involved in and very supportive of. But it's one effort to really raise the bar on all the voluntary standards, because I've mentioned the 4 big ones, but there are another 20 behind them spread around the world. And we want to make sure that they all have a high level of credibility to give public confidence, but also investor confidence. So this market has been growing like the last couple of years. I think it's doubled in size, and it I think is something that you can watch for the future. So as I think about state regulators that might be online today, and I think about the companies that you regulate, and some of them have made these net zero claims, and some of them are doing so under a belief that ultimately there will be something required of them. But they want to, my experience is they want to undertake the activities that have the highest level integrity if possible. And they're also going to be looking for rate relief on this, or rate recovery, cost recovery and rate making. And this is an area that you could be extremely helpful. And I consider this sort of like quasi-voluntary, because it's a way that regulatory systems might buttress voluntary claims. And I think the tools and techniques that are coming out of the voluntary markets, notably with the Integrity Council, can be a real benefit for state regulators in the future. Because you may not want to go through the brain damage of putting together your own offsetting standard. The state of California has done that for you in certain sectors. And similarly, many of these voluntary standards have architecture in place that you can lean upon and you can borrow from. And hopefully they will have an added degree of pedigree from the work of the Integrity Council. I'll probably talked my 10 minutes or more, Carl, so I'll stop there, but happy to take questions. But I hope that puts a frame around this of the history of where it's come from and what some of the potential is going forward.
Well, that's been very helpful, Dirk. Could you just give us very briefly a few of the kinds of issues that standards would have, so that as we talk, and go ahead.
Yeah, I think the big ones are around, there's always a set of criteria, and this is right from the get-go back in the early days of carbon offsetting, that you have to be able to prove that it wasn't already going to happen. We call that additionality. And one framing of additionality is whether it's required by law. So in the California instance, I don't want to jump on Jason's parade here, jump in front of his parade, but 85% of the economy is covered by regulatory system. So it's not eligible to produce an offset unless it's in the 15% that's not regulated. And that's a common feature of most offsetting programs, is that it's not required by law. But another would be other types of proof that are especially important in developing countries, around whether it's something that is financially so attractive that you would assume it's going to happen anyway, or that there may be regulatory barriers in place that make it difficult for a project to proceed. It also has to be a precise quantification quantification, a way to measure and verify it. So it has to be measurable and verifiable by a third-party auditor, because these are not things that you just say, hey, it complies and that takes care of it. You have to have an independent review of it. And you also have to assure that there are measures in place to assure permanence of the reductions that are being achieved, that they're not gonna, if it's a forest, that it's got buffers around it so that if there's a fire or other type of a degradation, a beetle kill or whatever, that that's accounted for. I'd say those are the big criteria around additionality, measurability, verifiability, permanence, and then there are a few other nice to haves that are on the list. But those are the proofs that you go through. There's expert judgment and tools and techniques around each one of these categories. But again, this is part of the work of the Integrity Council, is to make sure that this is being done in a common fashion across the various competing crediting standards.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And one of the questions that I think that we're very interested in addressing in this webinar is how we have those proofs in a regulatory context, and whether or not there's a set of best practices or a method of regulating that becomes acceptable, in particular across different jurisdictions and different states. Commissioner Danner, how are things looking in Washington with respect to the development of offsets?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Carl. As Carl said, I'm the chair of the Utilities and Transportation Commission in the state of Washington, and we regulate the investor-owned energy utilities in Washington state. In Washington, about half of our utilities are investor-owned. The others are consumer-owned and are not under our jurisdiction. And it's really interesting to see how far we have come. 15 years ago, it was actually illegal for utilities to purchase offsets. Our state Supreme Court had ruled that the purchase of offsets was not essential to the running of a utility. And so they said it was simply banned. It added costs, and those costs should be borne by taxpayers and not by ratepayers. So it wasn't until 2007 that the legislature passed a bill reversing that Supreme Court ruling and allowing only the consumer-owned utilities to spend funds acquired from ratepayers to reduce their environmental footprint, or their carbon footprint. And they gave the utilities the authority to purchase, trade, or bank greenhouse gas offsets or credits. And it's interesting because immediately following this, Seattle City Light, which is our state's largest consumer-owned electric company, began offsetting all of their carbon emissions. They're mostly a hydro system, so it wasn't as big a lift as it would be for a lot of other utilities, but they purchased 350,000 tons of carbon offsets in the first year and have done so ever since. And it's been things like biodiesel substitution and fuel switching and cement substitutes, and some deals with DuPont over fluorochemical capture of eliminating a gas when creating a refrigerant and so forth. And so today they have been carbon neutral for more than a decade. But they're not a state regulated utility, and without specific legislation authorizing offsets, our investor owned companies were simply not moving forward with the purchase of offsets, and it makes total sense. We have in the regulatory world, we have a used and useful standard. If we're going to allow recovery and rates, we want to make sure that that investment is used by the consumers and is useful. At that, we are looking at cost considerations because we want to keep costs of power down, and we're looking at prudency. Is it the right decision? Is it the least cost decision? And so because we simply didn't have a track record in this area, we didn't see that any of the private utilities were interested in purchasing offsets. The only exception to that, and I'll just fly by that, is basically when we had a renewable portfolio standard established by initiative in 2007, we did develop a renewable energy credit trading market, and that is verified by a division of the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, and that's called REGIS. It's the Western Renewable Energy Generation Information System. And it allows the utilities to offset non-renewable power with renewable power from other states and other utilities. But the kinds of offsets that you saw with Seattle City Light, or the ones that Dirk was talking about, were simply not part of the landscape for the investor owns. So we fast forward to 2019, and that's the year that our legislature passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act. And that's a bill that requires utilities to get off coal by 2025. They have to be carbon neutral by 2030, and then 100% carbon free by 2045. So that means that the utilities can use offsets for compliance with CETA until 2045. The law spelled out the kind of projects that would be eligible for offsets. They call these energy transformation projects. And they're pretty consistent with what you've heard from Dirk. I mean, there's a lot of home weatherization. They actually allow support for electrification of transportation, including EV charging, smart grid systems. The law says incentives for the sale of electric vehicles and incentives for the installation of charging equipment and incentives to install and operate equipment to produce renewable hydrogen and incentives for renewable hydrogen. So it's interesting that incentives themselves may be eligible for offsets. We'll have to figure that one out. But these are the kinds of things where that you heard from Seattle City Light are the kinds of things that we would expect our utilities to be doing in the next few years as they get up to deal with offsets. Now, the law did not discuss verification of these kinds of offsets other than to say that they must use a criteria developed by our Department of Ecology in consultation with my commission and the Department of Commerce. And it listed some factors. It's that basically emissions reductions must be A, real, specific, identifiable, and quantifiable, B, permanent, C, enforceable by the state of Washington, D, verifiable, E, not required by another statute, rule, or legal requirement, and F, not reasonably assumed to occur absent investment, or if an investment has already been made, not reasonably assumed to occur absent additional funding in the near future. So that's where we are with that law. Now, we have not yet finalized rules, and that's actually up to our Department of Ecology on how to do that. They haven't completed those right now. And in fact, since then, we have another overlay, which is that in 2020, our legislature passed a cap and trade program, the Climate Commitment Act. And it's a cap and trade program. It's similar to that in California and Quebec. And basically under the scheme, the emissions from industries, including gas utilities, they're capped, and the companies are awarded a certain number of allowances, and these allowances decline over time. And so the utilities have to either reduce their own carbon emissions or purchase allowances from other companies that have reduced their own emissions. And we're already starting to see things happen regarding offsets. Our state's Department of Natural Resources, which manages our state timberlands, has pulled 10,000 acres of forest lands out of production. Instead, they want to lease them for carbon offsets. As these kinds of projects expand, now we're just getting started on verification. So the questions we have as regulators is who should be doing the verification? What standards do these verifiers use? Should these be inside the commissions themselves? Do we have the expertise to do this? Do we need to use third-party verifiers? And that's what Jason will be talking about in California. And if we do, what is the methodology that they're going to use? Does it involve judgment calls? Does it allow a certain level of imprecision that may be outside the comfort zone of utility regulators? And then we have the other issue is, even if verified, what is the role of the utility regulators? We approve recovery and rates for investments, but we have to determine that those investments are least cost or at least lowest reasonable cost, and are they prudent? Are they providing benefits to the ratepayers? So all of these are the kinds of questions that I put forward as a problem statement. I think I don't have the answers because we're still in the process of figuring it out, and that's why I'm so glad to be on this webinar with Dirk and Annette and Jason, because we have a lot to learn here. So Carl, I think I've used up my 10 minutes.
Well, thank you so much. You know, I think that one of the themes that in addition to the regulatory issue that's coming out is just, and I think Jason will talk about this when he talks about the different kinds of offsets, is just how transformative offsets are, because they're a way of internalizing the value of carbon into lots of different kinds of activities in the economy where that internalization of that value is not happening. And I think Jason can tell us about what's happening in California and perhaps even touch on how offsets are affecting agriculture in California as well. Jason.
Well, thanks, Carl. And it's a real great honor to be here with all the panelists and the folks online. I recognize a few folks that are listening in, so hopefully my remarks will track with your experience in the California program as well. And I'll just state that I'm not here today to talk for California. I can no longer do that, but hopefully some of my perspective and experience can be helpful. My current role at UCLA is also helping on these exact same questions for other jurisdictions around the world, in particular states and provinces in tropical regions. How do we find ways to really drive investment to reduce emissions and benefit people? And I think that's what all these questions are really about, is how are we making sure that ratepayers are not adversely impacted? How are we making sure communities are benefited while we're reducing emissions? I'm gonna probably speak a little fast because I think I thought I'd keep under 10 minutes, Carl, but I wrote down some notes and
I'll do
my best. I'll do my best. So Dirk's framing was really, really great. I think that covered kind of the scope of what the history and kind of where we are. Commissioner Danner, it's just exciting to see where Washington is. I'll try to feed some of your questions into at least how California has looked at this in the past. But and hopefully help set up kind of the discussion, Annette, for you on all the work that the Integrity Council is doing here. I'm going to start with a few context points, kind of from my perspective as a former climate regulator, and I'll come back to that word as we go along, and market implementer here, hopefully to provide some useful experience. First, I mean, there is some difference, important differences between voluntary markets and compliance markets. And for me, the first point of that isn't necessarily on the integrity pieces, and I think that needs to be consistent across compliance and voluntary markets. It's more on who designs, who approves, who oversees, and consequences for non-compliance. And I think those were some of Commissioner Danner, some of your questions here as well. There are certainly some added layers of rigor in terms of public vetting and public process to develop regulations that incorporate or develop an offsets market within, say, a cap and trade program, and obviously legal mandates that need to be taken into account. Second kind of context point is, and this has been highlighted really well by Dirk and by Commissioner Danner, there are a lot of existing programs to draw lessons from, both from the voluntary space, but also from the compliance markets that have been operating for many years, and EU obviously for quite some time, RGGI in California in particular, and Quebec. So some of these questions, although they may be new kind of in the utility regulation space, have been worked on for quite some time. And I think the work of the Integrity Council and others are helping highlight those and advance them further. So hopefully that provides some comfort to utility regulators as you start to grapple with these questions. There are models to draw from that have been implemented. Third, many of these questions relate directly to the integrity measures that we're all talking about. And I think we all would agree that we need to make sure, if we're giving credit for an activity, in particular to use against a compliance obligation in a carbon market, but also to be used in kind of voluntary commitments as well, you need to have those criteria that Dirk and Commissioner Danner laid out. California incorporated the same language from the UN context. I know Washington's legislation is also looking at that. So really quickly, real, additional, quantifiable, verifiable, permanent, enforceable. I'll go through some of how those, I think, impact integrity and how some of that may differ between a voluntary and a compliance market, just for points of context. It's also really important how you define those and then how you hold those systems accountable against those definitions. And I think that comes up often in questions of uncertainty, and even in questions of integrity, but also confidence in the market, making sure that those definitions are clear and people understand what they are, and ideally they're vetted through some kind of public process. For the California context, let me just go through a couple of design elements that I think are pretty consistent across most compliance markets, but I'll just talk through how California at least worked through these. and in particular, the ones that relate to, I think most importantly, to integrity. First, and Dirk covered this as well, is any system is only as good as the data. So making sure you have very good data. How is it quantified? How is it captured? What does it show? What are the requirements for that? And how are you making sure that that has some kind of level of accountability through, for example, third-party verification? And I'm happy to go into that question, Commissioner Danner, more as we go along here. Offsets are no different. They need to have very good data. It's often called monitoring, reporting, verification, or MRV in the carbon market speak. And that really, you need to make sure that they're real, quantifiable, and verifiable, so that it's not just a project saying this is what's happening. You have an ability to oversee and have that confidence in the program. And that data also needs to be available to buyers of those instruments, if they're going to be a compliance instrument or a voluntary instrument. You need to have due diligence from buyers so they know what they're purchasing. I think from a utility regulator perspective, it's the same thing. You need to know what these actually are. I see a lot of voluntary market platforms that are developing. There's huge interest in the carbon markets. I say markets because there's not one monolithic market. And some of these platforms purport to sell credits or certificates or tokenization. And some of them don't have any data behind them. You can buy a credit without knowing where it's from. And I think that's quite dangerous for how to develop markets that actually have the confidence. It's important to be able to show where the data is from, what's the activity being credited. Next is really the standards that define all these rules. As Dirk said, California took a look at the voluntary standards developed by the American Carbon Registry, by the Climate Action Reserve. We took those and adapted them into the regulatory context through a public regulatory process. Those define the reporting and verification requirements, done again through that public process, eligibility of activities and practices going into additionality criteria. California has that requirement, as it sounds like in Washington, in terms of beyond what's required by law and beyond what's otherwise happening in a conservative business as usual scenario. So really that kind of what's going on in practice. As well as how long can these be credited, what permanence requirements are in place, and all the rules that kind of swirl around that. From an additionality perspective, as Dirk said, defining the scope of your program is important. So California has an economy-wide cap on our state. Most activities and sectors are already covered. So things like home weatherization, things like solar installation, things like fuel switching, those are not eligible under our carbon market for offsets, although they're very important activities. And I think that's something that utility regulators and communities and utilities themselves have a lot of experience figuring out how to make sure those different investments happen. But defining what your scope is, if you have a regulatory compliance market, may impact what's eligible for offsets or not. It also defines the scope of how you develop those rules, those standards, and then California has adapted and adopted state-level regulatory enforceable standards that the state oversees. Right now, that's for forest projects, for destruction of refrigerants and other ozone-depleting substance gases, dairy digesters for the capture and destruction of methane, mine methane capture projects, rice cultivation projects, and urban forests. Those are the 6 standards that we have in California currently. And we have some recommendations, others to look at. Third level of issue here is transparency, both from a good data perspective, but also for making sure that there's price discovery. So how, if you're in a market, you want to make sure that folks don't have an advantage over others. You want to make sure that that has some transparency in terms of price discovery. In the California context, there are reports from the climate regulator, from the Air Resources Board, on weighted average values put out quarterly, but also on the secondary markets. These are overseen by CFTC through exchanges. What are prices for offsets, kind of standardized contracts? Those are really important for the evolution of an efficient market. At least that's the context we've seen in California. California to date puts out information on every project that's issued, working with the voluntary registries, puts out information on how many credits have been issued. So far, California's issued credits to over 500 projects across 39 states in the US. For about 240 million credits have been issued since 2012. From a rough estimation of a climate finance perspective, that's about $2.5 to $3 billion worth of investment in emission reduction projects really throughout the country. And one other area that standardization discussion is, are you looking at project level accounting like the CDM approach, or are you developing a standard that every project in that activity type has to meet? California chose the latter. It's rigorous, but also able to be implemented. So that's another design question for regulators to consider. And then enforcement. How do you enforce these? Voluntary market space, it's really done through contract. In a compliance market, there's additional layers that the regulator can put on top of that through an enforcement mechanism, legal challenges in terms of civil and criminal penalties if needed. Really focused from a climate regulator's perspective on making sure there's atmospheric integrity. And another integrity measure is, are there other co-benefits besides just carbon that may be considered? Air quality, water quality, social and environmental safeguards in the international context, et cetera. Just for kind of one last point of context, or several last points of context, sorry, on other goals that may go beyond just the integrity questions for criteria. What are the goals of the program? Are you looking for cost containment? That's what the California program, the legislation required, was finding lower cost instruments that also drive reductions in non-regulated sectors. That's important from a ratepayer context as well. Or maybe your goals are to drive investment into really nascent technology or emerging technology. That may be more expensive as an instrument, but it may be a really good policy and atmospheric goal. Or maybe you're looking to drive investment into underserved areas of the world, for example, tropical forests. And maybe you have all these goals, and that's something to balance as the regulator. And I think the voluntary marketplace can play that really excellent complementary role with the regulatory space of figuring out what are ways to do that in with high integrity. Certainty, I think folks talked about that already. From a compliance market perspective, the market needs that certainty of design, frequency of updates, how long those credits are able to be used. What is the primary data on this from the regulator or from the voluntary market? Those types of questions. And location, where can you issue credits? So if you're in a compliance market like California, the decision was made that these credits should be able to come if they meet these standards from throughout the United States and potentially more broadly. This also provides an important level of partnership development and what I like to think of as climate diplomacy. For example, most of our forest credits, which is the majority of credits in California's program, are actually coming from tribal and Alaska Native corporation projects, which has been a really interesting kind of legal partnership, and I think a really great development in terms of that relationship between a subnational jurisdiction with nations like tribal nations and Alaska Natives. And then a really important question I know is front and center in Washington as well is, are there limits? Should a compliance entity be able to meet all of its compliance obligation based on the purchase of offsets? Or maybe there's limits that are put in place. In California, the decision was made at the beginning of the program that it should be only a very small portion of the program. So companies could use only up to 8% of their overall emissions could be met using offsets. The legislature in 2017 cut that in half, really listening to some of the concerns that were raised by local communities in California to try to drive additional reductions within the state. So there's additional considerations on how many offsets can someone actually use. And then lastly, from a regulatory perspective, the differences between utility regulators and air regulators and financial regulators, that's a really important question for all regulators to sort of come together and make sure there's good lines of communication. In the California context, that legislation gave the ability to the air regulator, giving a certainty to market participants of really who is overseeing this, where are the levels of connection with other regulators. That's really important from a design and implementation perspective, and also from an enforcement perspective. So the California folks, my former team works very closely with folks in FERC, folks at the CFTC, understanding where the overlaps are, making sure that cases can be referred if there are cases necessary to take forward. So who is going to regulate and how is that communication done? And lastly, this goes back to the question of kind of home weatherization things. If your market is designed in a way where certain activities are not additional, that doesn't mean that you don't need to have those activities occur. So finding ways to think through investment, in particular in the utility space, this is already happening. I know it in California, I know it's probably throughout the rest of the country. So pairing those different types of tools, offsets, allowances in a compliance market, and also other ways to drive reductions in a targeted fashion. Just another point of context that I think is an interesting growing discussion in California as to, does it have to be an offset, or can it be some kind of other investment tool that pairs along with offsets and with allowances? So I'll leave it there. I've probably gone way over my time, Carl, but hopefully that's helpful perspective.
No, it's all good information, and I'm going to just ask you a quick question for clarification, and that is, when you're talking about the FERC, there's all sorts of regulatory activities at the FERC, and the CFTC, certainly a bit narrower. You described who you were dealing with at the FERC. Could you just sort of explain that, what the FERC's role has been and the CFTC role with respect to the enforcement activities that you've been coordinating on?
Yeah, and the engagement between California and FERC has really not been on the offset space. It's really been on, is there something in the carbon market on the California side that's potentially impacting or being impacted by fuels or electric markets? So there's really a good coordination between kind of the market monitoring side of the California program along with FERC's market monitoring team. So the lawyers and the market monitors. CFTC does have some overlap with the offset space because under the way that that California's designed the program here, there are futures and options and derivatives contracts that sell on exchanges for allowances and for offset credits that are overseen by CFTC. So making sure that the California climate regulators have good insight into what's going on those contract markets, and vice versa, that CFTC understands what's going on in the kind of primary market overseen by California. So ensuring that there's really great coordination across kind of those regulatory arms of each jurisdiction or of each agency. And if there's a referral that's not in California's jurisdiction, so something's going on the exchange to be made to CFTC or vice versa, that can happen.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Annette, we're looking forward to hearing about the Integrity Council and your activities there and how you're going to make coherence to all of this.
Well, thanks so much. And I think one of the great lessons from listening to everyone else, including Jason, who just gave a fabulous overview on the regulated side, is just how much we are trying to borrow from the regulated markets for the voluntary carbon market. The Integrity Council is a new independent governance body for the voluntary carbon market. We were established in September of last year to build on the foundations that were laid by the predecessor entity, which was the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. And that group brought together a huge number of entities and experts from across the ecosystem to really look at the state of the existing voluntary carbon markets and say, what do we need to do? What is the blueprint that we need to create to make this a better marketplace? And we took the work of the task force forward in this new independent governance body, and are focused specifically on a number of topics that I'll go into a bit more detail on. But at base, our purpose is to ensure that the voluntary carbon market accelerates a just transition to 1.5 degrees. And we're doing that first and foremost in the early stages by setting and enforcing definitive global threshold standards. And we're going to do that. And now Jason talked a lot about measuring and auditability and all that, and that's exactly what we're focused on. And we're trying to do it by drawing on the best science and expertise that is currently available, so that high quality carbon markets can channel finance towards genuine and additional greenhouse gas emissions reductions and removals, and that go above and beyond what could otherwise be achieved and can contribute to climate resilient development. That goes again to the issue of, Jason was talking about how much can you use this for? Well, this should be the additional what contributes. It's not the primary means of achieving net zero. It should be something that contributes in addition to the first and foremost, our primary goal is to, to reduce our emissions primarily. So we're doing this by building on world-leading and globally diverse expertise across the carbon value chain. We have an expert panel that is working on crafting these core carbon principles. They're made up of 12 leading carbon market experts with long-standing experience in the environmental and social integrity of carbon markets. And they're also supported by a number of subject matter experts in topics that range from things like carbon sequestration science to the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. We've also benefited from the strategic advice and insight of a distinguished advisory group that we put together, which is 30 members who are really esteemed global leaders in this field. And we also are now fortunately benefiting from the insights of representatives from indigenous people and local communities. And we recently welcomed the managing director from the FSC Indigenous Foundation, who is Francisco Souza, and Hindu Ibrahim to our distinguished advisory group. So we think it's very important that we take into account the views of the IPLC community in this work stream. So, basic question, what is it we're doing? Our mandate has 3 parts. First, we're establishing, hosting, and curating, as I said earlier, this set of core carbon principles, which will delineate a threshold standard for determining what high quality and high integrity carbon credits are, and what standards and methodology types may issue them. Second, to provide governance and oversight over standard setting organizations on adherence to CCPs, as well as on market infrastructure and participant eligibility. I know others talked about, the importance of transparent markets and having the market data, and the importance of integrity in that sense, and that is something that we're keenly focused on. And third, we want to help and coordinate and manage the interlinkages between individual bodies to define a roadmap for responsible growth of the voluntary carbon market. I think we already talked earlier about a number of interlinkages, even on the regulatory side, but there are a number of organizations that are focused on carbon market integrity, and it's very important to work collaboratively along those work streams. So our core carbon principles are high-level principles that are supported by an assessment framework that will set out detailed criteria for each principle on how to apply the core carbon principles and which standards and methodology types could issue them. For example, grid-connected renewable energy or avoided deforestation methodologies. Again, it's critically important that we not only set these core carbon principles and threshold standards, but that we be able to, in some sense, enforce them. I know we heard earlier, and it's absolutely true, that in the voluntary carbon markets, since they're not regulated, an organization like the Integrity Council would not have regulatory authority to necessarily enforce the CCPs the way a regulator would. On the other hand, we're trying to mimic the regulatory benefits as much as possible, and among other things would use whatever tools we have, including naming and shaming those who are not complying with the principles but claim to be, in addition to, after we've done our assessments, if we determine that any of the standard setting organizations, let's say, or the standards are not appropriately applying the CCPs, we could, among other things, sort of make it clear that they're no longer authorized to issue CCP eligible contracts. So obviously we're at a very important juncture here because we are trying to work apace to publish these core carbon principles. We are hoping to launch sometime in the second quarter of this year a public consultation of the CCPs. We're trying to issue these in a very open and transparent way, in a way that actually mimics, let's say, a notice and comment process for a regulator. We want to have full transparency about our process. We're very eager in having the public viewing these and providing comments, and those comments will feed into what becomes what we publish as the final CCPs and the assessment framework, which we're hoping to do in the third quarter of 2022. And we certainly welcome anyone who is interested to look at them and to engage in our public consultation. That would be very valuable to us. So talking a little bit, I mean, and I know others have focused on this as well, but you really can't overstate the importance of bringing integrity to the voluntary carbon market. I don't think I'm sure we can't reach our 1.5 degree goals without using every tool in the toolbox, and the voluntary market could play a very important role in accelerating the transition to net zero. But it will only succeed, and it will only be additive if it is rooted in very high integrity. And to us, high integrity means a number of things. It means knowing that the credits are doing what they say they're doing, because there's a definitive global threshold standard for high quality credits. Secondly, it means transparency and confidence in prices, because high quality credits are trading in a market based on rigorous standards and market infrastructure. And third, it means that buyers are making legitimate claims and they're using credits that are based on accepted standards as part of a credible net zero pathway. So again, our theory of change is simple. If you build a market with integrity, scale will follow. So if we create the conditions that ensure high integrity in the generation and exchange of voluntary carbon credits, that will increase accountability and build a much better system and allow transparent, deep, standardized, and liquid markets to develop. A powerful price signal hopefully will then emerge and efficiently mobilize finance, enabling the market to scale. And importantly, we want to drive investment in high quality supply and accelerate climate resilient development, green growth, and large scale emissions reductions and removals. We talked a little earlier about how the current market, it's quite clear, is really not fit for purpose. We hear a lot of accusations of greenwashing and things of that nature, and there are issues that we have. Today the market is really much more opaque. It certainly lacks a widely accepted threshold for what a high quality credit is. Those concerns over quality certainly dampen confidence and therefore dampen interest in trading in the market. If you don't have fully transparent, deep liquid, standardized markets, you're not going to get the kind of investment and engagement in this market that obviously would be impactful. And there's also a lack of common standards on the legitimate use of credits as part of the net zero pathway. And obviously, again, that is where we have concerns about greenwashing and the like. So to get the voluntary carbon markets to contribute as efficiently as possible, we need to address all of these factors that undermine confidence and transparency today, and that open the door to, as I said earlier, the concerns about greenwashing. And these are the same barriers that undermine the voluntary carbon's market's ability to efficiently mobilize finance towards mitigation and climate resilient development that is so urgently needed. So we like to say, I won't go too much longer. I think I'm out of my 10 minutes, but we are now saying that a high integrity voluntary carbon market needs to be clean, CLEAN, and clean is catalytic in that it will mobilize finance towards mitigation, especially in developing countries, and accelerate innovation and market uptake of emerging breakthrough technologies, which would be very important as well. L is local. We talked earlier about how carbon offsets can create jobs in local communities. That is one of the additional features. It can deliver sustainable development co-benefits and the like. E is empowering, because what we're really doing here is accelerating the implementation of NDCs and net zero commitments and paving the way for increased ambition. A is additional. We heard lots from prior speakers on additionality and how important that is in making sure that when we have investment in these products, that it's really going to projects that otherwise would not have happened. And nature positive, again, the importance of protecting our ecosystems, especially forests and natural habitats. So I was, again, I was very interested in hearing others talk about the regulated markets here. And let me just say, as a former regulator, I think that the best approach that we can and are taking is to work in a manner that is really adjacent and mimics the compliance markets. It seems to me that the more that the voluntary carbon markets are open, transparent, trade on organized exchanges or platforms, have trade reporting, end-to-end reporting transparency. We'll see efficient pricing. We'll also ultimately, if in sometime in the future, these activities got folded into regulated markets, it would be ideal that they be as sort of closely aligned in terms of the regulatory approaches as possible. So that is our goal, and I'll end it there, Carl, but hopefully that's given you some sense of how busy we are in the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Markets.
Terrific. Well, that was really informative and very helpful. And it just we as regulators and people who are deep in the weeds often use terms that lots of people aren't familiar with. Could you just perhaps give us the definition of greenwashing, so folks would understand? It's not a compliment, right?
It's not a compliment. It's a very pejorative term. It really, it's a term that, obviously everybody wants to say that they're doing what they can, for climate change. And so you have folks who engage in carbon offset purchases, but in projects that don't have integrity. We talked earlier about there really is no measurable impact in terms of carbon reduction. They're just doing it to say that they're good citizens, and that unfortunately has given carbon offsets a very bad name, and rightfully so. I mean, I think carbon offsets can serve an incredibly important role, but not if they're traded in the way that some are traded today, where there's no integrity, there's no transparency. The pricing is so bad, it really is just a way to check the box. They're doing what they can.
Yeah, I agree. Carbon offsets, in my mind, are absolutely transformative. We had one question that I think is or actually two questions that I'm going to merge into one, which is, really goes to what a carbon offset is. And Jason, maybe you can address this. Why, if the goal is to go to net zero, what does a carbon offset do? For a particular state, what does a carbon offset do to us? And I think, how do we measure what is the definition? We kind of skipped the definition of what a carbon offset is. Jason.
Sure, and I mean, I'm a lawyer here, so there's a lot of nuance behind it, as we all know, but I think generally a carbon offset represents 1 metric ton of greenhouse gas emission reduction, removal, or sequestration. What it does for a program depends on the design of a program. So for instance, in a compliance market like California, an offset credit represents a type of instrument that can be turned into the state of California based on an entity's emissions. Same thing as a carbon allowance, which is really a permit to emit. I think from an atmospheric perspective, though, those offsets don't just represent a reduction or sequestration, they represent investment into that type of activity for that transformative approach that I think we're all talking about. So it kind of depends on what the overall structure of a program is, but an offset is intended to represent a reduction of 1 metric ton, essentially.
Exactly. So it's 1 metric ton, and the theory is that, correct me if I'm wrong, that no matter where in the world you reduce that metric ton from a carbon greenhouse gas perspective is equivalent.
That's right. Then you layer on top of that other goals and other policy objectives, but yeah, that's right.
Right, and we'll touch base on those. I'm going to open it up to the speakers. I indicated that if there are comments or questions the speakers have on the other speakers, I'd like to hear those. Otherwise, I have more questions. So the floor is open, folks.
Well, all right, let me start. I want to know, we talked about third-party verification. Basically, utility regulatory commissions don't really have the in-house capabilities to be doing verifications of offsets. We're going to have to figure out who's going to do that. In California, they use, I think there's 16 companies that are approved by CARB to look at these. And my question is, what is, well, I maybe got that number wrong, Jason. What is the vetting process for those companies, and what kind of instruction do they receive, and who oversees them?
Sure, that's a really good question. So I'll give the California context and then maybe speak more broadly. So in the California context, one of the initial design discussions was that question: who is going to be overseeing verification? How do we do verification? There is a national standards body, ANSI, and I think many countries have a similar standards body that do accreditation of auditors for different purposes. Many of the verification bodies that are in California, I think, are also ANSI accredited, but that's quite expensive, and it may not be as tailored to the specifics of the methodology you're asking a verifier to verify. So California made the decision to develop its own accreditation process. California, the Air Resources Board is the standard setting body for the methodologies. It adopts those regulations. It then develops training courses to have verifiers go through training and take exams. And if they pass an exam, they can get accreditation under the California structure. California then is able to oversee those verifiers. So it's really layering on a lot of regulatory oversight purposefully, but not requiring just ANSI accreditation. Also expanded the ability to have multiple types of much smaller companies setting up in California or elsewhere who could do verification as well. The regulation in California specifies the types of educational and experience background that verifiers themselves need to have, and then specifies requirements for the verification companies to make sure they are not a fly-by-night entity. I mean, they have to have certain levels of insurance. They have to show that they're actually a going business. All those are spelled out in the regulation, and then California trains it. So just for capacity perspective, the California team also does not have the ability to go out and verify 500 plus offset projects, let alone all of the reporting entities under our capped sectors. But we do have teams. California Air Resources Board has teams that oversee the training and then do audits of those verifiers. So they spell out all those structured performance that the verifiers have to do, can go and do an audit of the verifier as they're doing their verification, which also gives the California staff an ability to see what's going on at the facility or at the offset project. So all of these kind of design questions were geared towards making sure that there is just this enhanced oversight of the verification process while leveraging that independent experience of those verification bodies. That helps.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And if I may ask Carl a follow-up question.
No, please. Sure.
So the question I have then is, how precise do we have to be? We have organizations now like Annette's that basically I see that as kind of giving an underwriter laboratory kind of seal of approval or a good housekeeping seal of approval. Would that be enough for a utility regulator to say, okay, especially if the SEC is going to be looking at this in their disclosures and air regulators are going to be looking, and there's a way we can cross-check to see that, they're giving the same answers to everyone. Are we setting up a system where perhaps the voluntary compliance regulators can also be the compliance regulators? And maybe that's a question for Dirk or Annette as well.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I feel like it in California, Jason, you guys might have started this, but I do feel like there's a bit of convergence of the two. And increasingly, I think my member companies are thinking about it as one global market that has two types of demand, either a compliance demand or a voluntary demand. But you want the units that are being traded to have kind of that same threshold veracity to them. And there's an international corollary to the ANSI certification of the verifiers that I think will be redone now that we have a rule book for Article 6. It's also something that in the Integrity Council that we'll be looking at whether we're happy with what that is or whether we feel like there needs to be something in place in advance of it. But I do think that the convergence of those two, why I referenced this earlier in my remarks, I think you guys are actually sitting in a really enviable place compared to where Jason and his predecessors would have been 12 years ago, where it's a blank sheet of paper. And instead, you've got all these structures you can lean upon. Now, I think they're going to have the veracity that they could withstand muster with whether it's an SEC disclosure, a FERC filing, or a state regulatory proceeding. But I do think this is a growth area for state regulators because your companies are under pressure from customers and from investors to show that they can get to net zero in a way that preserves energy security and environmental security and does so cost effectively, right? They're going to have that same interest in cost effectiveness that, Carl, I think that's where you started us off on what offsets bring to the party, is that they improve the cost effectiveness by widening the array of possibilities of who can be involved. So I think it's definitely a growth area that, I can tell, Dave, that you're on top of it, but I hope others will be exploring it with great interest because I think it's important.
And I just had one comment on the precision question, because I think that's not just for the verification piece, but it's also for what the standards require. So a quantification method, at least in the California context, which again is adapting a lot of the voluntary standards into a regulatory approach, each one of those quantification methods builds in uncertainty parameters. So essentially making sure that you're very conservative on what you're issuing as a credit, which really, I think from my perspective, means you're under-crediting for many of these activities. That's important to work through that technical context with how you actually issue a credit to make sure that's understood. The second piece on verifiers is California pulled in international standards from the IPCC on some of those uncertainties and the precision. So a verifier isn't looking for 100% concurrence with what a project or with what a reporting entity comes up with. They're looking for plus or minus 95% assurance, but they're focusing on, and this is where, as the markets and the players get more experience in this, they can focus on those areas of a report or of an activity where there's higher uncertainty. So they're doing essentially what a financial auditor would do and targeting the areas of higher risk, and then coming up with their report and their independent assessment based on the standards that California set or whatever the standard body is, and coming up with that level of assurance. So that's similar to how other financial audits and auditors work. So if that provides some assurance that there's a lot of lessons learned from similar or analogous programs.
I'd just add to, Dave was talking about, sort of the confluence of all these different, whether you have the assessment frameworks, or you've got the SEC looking at these things, or are they looking at it, or they're requiring disclosure. We have a bit of a ways to go on that. I mean, as you know, the SEC only recently has proposed disclosure. It's very ambitious disclosure, but heretofore, I think the disclosures have been sort of wildly disparate. Some people disclosed, some people didn't. Those who disclosed didn't always get it right, because you could even check their own filings, and they were inconsistent in the way they described things. So they weren't even necessarily consistent among companies themselves, never mind across industries. One of the things that I looked at, and I haven't studied it in great detail, or I don't know how many hundreds of pages the disclosure document is, but there is reference to offsets in the SEC's proposal. And interestingly, it would require companies to disclose whether they use offsets. It doesn't say like what's the integrity of the offset. I actually looked and said, you don't want to end up with unintended consequences where people are disclosing the use of offsets, and in some way that's encouraging them to do that, but it's not encouraging them to engage in trading of high quality offsets. So one of the things I would hope, although, whether that they would acknowledge that there would be some standard setters, whether it's ICVCM or others, hopefully ICVCM as primary, but where, they would have to say whether or not the offsets actually were, in alignment with, high quality standards. And so I think we do have a bit of a road ahead of us in getting to the right place.
George, did you have your
Yeah, I was just going to, and I'll build on what Annette said. I think this is something that I'm sure many of us will be commenting on in the rulemaking process, to urge them to be a bit more fulsome on that, because there has been some history in the voluntary disclosure universe where it was just a box you ticked, and you could get the same amount of credit if you, as a company, offset one flight, or if you offset an entire, every flight, and that was insufficient, right? So we wanted to have more practicality to it than that, more usefulness. But I think with the Integrity Council process coming along, and that being a sort of that seal of approval, but also the CORSIA program, we got, we don't make a lot of this, but the U.S. federal government is in a program where it recognizes carbon offsets from these private carbon stands. Not every credit because it's also got a quality threshold to it. But I think that's huge. And if I were a state regulator, I would be thinking about that they've already taken a lot of the pain out of it for you in the standards review that was done there. So if it's good enough for United Airlines or Delta Airlines, should it be good enough for Pacificor, right? That's, I think, a valid question. But also, when I come back to that disclosure at the SEC, if you're not using an Integrity Council CCP unit, and you're not using a CORSIA unit, then what are you using? And is anything else going to have veracity? Like I do think we can build this in a way that actually enables this market to scale. And that's something that, in the compliance universe, I was going to actually ask Jason a question about the forestry sector, because it's a sector that typically doesn't get covered. And it's one that I know you do some work in. And frankly, the removals capability there is going to be hugely important as we decarbonize. You get to a point where those removals, be it natural or technological, are going to be hugely important. And I think we ought to be planning these systems with a view towards that. And I know California has sort of at least got its toe in the water for possible conversations internationally on that. And I wonder if you want to just give a little flavor of that for the group.
Yeah, I think the potential, I mean, the realness right now of the forest sector in terms of that is the majority of offset credits that are issued under California's program. But recognizing that emissions from land change, forest change, deforestation, that's larger than the global transportation sector emissions. I mean, it's a massive emission source that is a really hard one to address. And I'm going to use this moment, Dirk, because there's a couple comments in here in the chat on the question side in terms of referencing some work by a group called Carbon Plan. Forests are also one of the more controversial areas. There's folks that really want to dig into areas to say that's not conservative enough, that's not real. I guess from my perspective, the level of rigor and the amount of work that the California Air Resources Board with projects throughout the country have done has really incentivized incredible emission reduction and sequestration projects throughout the country, with the potential for looking how that could be implemented at scale across an entire jurisdiction. And that's where some of the jurisdictions I work with now are really looking at. I think that goes to some of the certification questions, some of the certainty questions for sure. It also goes to what standard is being used to develop those requirements. So some of the papers that are referenced in the questions right now develop their own standard and are holding California against that. So it's, again, a question of how are you defining your program and how do you assess it against those standards or those targets, but also looking for continuing improvement. Forest space, Dirk, as you know, continuing improvement is really the name of the game for how do you figure out how to better quantify deforestation versus degradation versus scale versus projects. But we know the IPCC continually recognizes this without addressing both nature based solutions as well as all of our other emission sources. We've got to do all of it. So I think the forest space provides not just a necessary thing we have to try to address because the amount of emissions coming out and the livelihood impacts that they have are massive. But from a climate impact, we just have to. So sorry for the soapbox, but and I'll provide it.
That's what we're here for. to share ideas and to let me turn to one of the questions in the chat so that we at least answer a few of them. This is a great conversation. But in that, do you envision, since you're the financial regulator here, do you envision secondary markets in offset derivatives that are bundled to spread risk?
You know, I've been asked that question before. I think anything is possible in the capital markets. And so I definitely think we're going to see secondary market trading, which interestingly, you know, when we talk about this being an unregulated market, I think once and Jason referred to the CFTC in other contexts, I think once you start seeing futures trading in these things, you will have the CFTC involved in all likelihood. And I do think that there's a lot of interest in bundling these products, particularly when you have very small projects that, you know, likely are not really that economical as a trading contract on their own, but perhaps could be bundled. So I think you know, it's certainly possible.
Okay, let me take one question another question out of the chat, which is what principles apply to the lifespan of a credit?
Well, so I'll take the bait on it. there's two ways you think about the timing. One is there are crediting periods for how long a project can receive credit. And sometimes those projects, this is maybe, Jason, your point about sometimes it's undercredited because it may be a project, a technology or something that stays in place for 30 years, but typically you'll only get to credit a 10-year window of it. Or I think in the Paris Agreement, you can either have one 10-year period or you can have 3 5-year periods, but at each 5-year increment, the baseline might ratchet down, so you might get fewer and fewer credits. So that's a maximum of 15. In the removals area, they're looking at longer crediting periods because a large direct air capture project or CCS project or even a forestry project may need a lot longer time frame. Those might be more like 15 or 3 15s where the baseline adjusts. So that's on the credit issuance side. Typically on the credit, on the usefulness in a market, there's been bankability on them. And there's been some question, this was like a big question in Glasgow around whether old CDM credits were going to be bankable into the future program. They allowed partial, they sort of cut the baby and they allowed a certain time vintages of them to be used in the first period. So they kind of bounded on when it was created and when you could use it. But I think that's sort of just a typical kind of a political transitioning. But I think in markets, investors usually like to know, especially for these large capital intensive ones, that once they operate and once you create a removal unit, that it would be valid, until it's used for compliance. And then when you tender it for compliance, the regulator like Jason typically cancels it out of the system, so it can't be used again. And that's what we're trying to mimic in voluntary markets. How did I do?
You all did great. And we're coming to the end of our time, and I just can't thank you all enough. This is a vitally important question for the regulated utilities and beyond. Obviously, it's a vitally important question worldwide. We as public utility regulators are familiar with what I call counterfactual markets. We're not buying a widget. We're not buying something. We have developed methods of measurement and verification for energy efficiency and successfully, as a regulatory body, community, found ways to deal with these counterfactual markets. And I hope that this conversation that we had today is a step towards improving and developing and starting a dialogue in the Public Utility Commission space on the integrity of markets. And Jason, I want to thank you for pointing out to me that it's not only the public. I mean, as an economic regulator, I think about financial regulation, I think about the FERC, but you really have hit the nail on the head for me in terms of defining the importance of the environmental regulators playing a critical role in all of this. So thank you for doing that. And I want to thank you all. And I want to thank everybody who has joined us today. And I wish you a good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are and whatever it is. But thank you very much for attending. And
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much.